Now, the rest of the story. Once upon a time, there was a fair-haired farm boy named Jim who had 25 cats. Most of them lived out in the barn and chased mice. A few were beloved house pets. All of them had names. Jim's cats were more than farm animals, you see. They were family. Each was distinctly recognizable, not only by appearance but by personality. Each had its own habits and quirks, its own needs and sensitivities. Jim found something to love in every one of them, and each in its own way returned the affection. Since infancy, Jim was plagued with severe asthma. It almost killed him when he was 9. The chronic illness kept him in bed a lot. But Jim's frequent confinement never became impossibly lonely, for there was always at least one cat nearby, one little whiskered, wide-eyed friend who seemed somehow to understand. These were the memories that Jim took with him from the family farm near Fairmount, Indiana, into adulthood, into a $1.60 an hour agency job, and one day he fell in love. Her name was Carolyn. She was pretty and she was fun. He proposed, she accepted, and one evening after they were married, Jim learned the rest of the story. The couple was visiting a friend's house for the first time. They were greeted at the door. 5 minutes later, Carolyn's eyes suddenly became teary and red. Jim, puzzled and concerned, asked what was wrong. By then, his bride was scratching and sneezing. She turned to their host. "You have a cat," she declared. Well, in fact, he did not, and furthermore, he had had no pets in the past 2 years that he had owned the house. What about the previous owners? Carolyn insisted. The gentleman thought for a moment. Why, yes, in fact, they had had several cats. Jim was astounded. He had never even suspected his wife's allergy, much less the incredible acuteness of it. Now, what was he to do? He had loved cats since childhood. He had hoped to have pet cats again someday. Now he could not even go near a cat for fear of sending his dear Carolyn into a sneezing fit. Over the years which followed, Jim tried his best to be considerate. He visited cat owners and cuddled their pets, always alone. Then, returning to his own home, he would head straight for the laundry room and remove all of his clothing, including his socks, toss everything in the washing machine, then take a shower, washing even his hair. All this Jim did for the love of Carolyn. And yet he continued to seek a more satisfying solution to their dilemma. And then at last Jim created for himself a paper pet. A paper pet. A cat made of paper and ink and memories. And wife Carolyn was not allergic to him, for Jim, the fair-haired Indiana farm boy, who grew up loving cats by the dozens, the frustrated husband whose wife's allergy ensured a catless marriage, he, Jim Davis, at least partly solved that problem, and in the process bestowed upon the rest of us an unforgettable funny paper feline. You may have wondered how life began for a sarcastic, overstuffed, lazy, lovable cat named Garfield. Well, now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. James Robert Jim Davis was born in Marion, Indiana on July 28, 1945. He grew up on a Black Angus cow farm in Fairmount, Indiana. Jim's childhood mirrored that of Garfield's owner, John Arbuckle. In real life, Jim grew up on a farm with one brother, Dave Davis. John Arbuckle also grew up on a farm with one brother, Doc Boy. Both Jim and John grew up with animals. Both had the same occupation, but we'll get to that later. At Fairmount High School, Jim worked on the school's newspaper called The Breeze. It was in The Breeze that Jim published his first comic strip, which was largely based on the school life. He worked on the yearbook staff, and in his senior year, Jim created a majority of the illustrations in the yearbook, which included many of the same characters from his early comic strip. After high school, Jim's artistic abilities helped him land a job in an advertising agency. In 1969, he began working on Tom Ryan's comic strip, Tumbleweeds. While working for Tom, Jim created a comic strip called Norm Nat, Gnormgnat. Norm Nat ran weekly from 1973 to 1975 in the Pendleton, Indiana newspaper called the Pendleton Times. Jim tried to turn Norm Nat into a syndicated comic strip, but an editor told him, "Your art is good, your gags are great, but nobody can relate to bugs." Jim began to rethink his whole process. He needed a relatable character. He knew he wanted to create a comic strip which featured an animal, but he was undecided on what kind of animal. When he looked closely at the other syndicated comics, the most often used animal was a dog, but he thought the comic market was saturated with dogs. None of them, however, featured a cat. In 1976, Jim abandoned Norm Nat and began a new comic strip simply called, no, not Garfield, the comic strip was called John. Now we all know what John and Garfield look like, right? Well, not so fast. This is what John and Garfield originally looked like. This is the first published John comic strip. John Arbuckle was loosely based on Jim Davis himself. You may be surprised to learn that John Arbuckle's occupation is, as a cartoonist, much like Jim Davis. Originally, John was the star of the comic strip and Garfield was a secondary character along with John's dog. No, not Odie. He was originally called Spot. Like Norm Nat, the John comic ran in the Pendleton Times. In 1978, Jim's career was forever changed when he revamped the comic strip to feature Garfield as the star of the comic. Now, through the years, John and Garfield evolved into what we know in love. Did you know that there's a direct link between Garfield the cat and an assassinated U.S. president? You see, Garfield, the lovable but sarcastic cat, got his name and personality from Jim Davis's grandfather, James A. Garfield Davis, who was named in honor of President James A. Garfield, our second assassinated president. First, of course, was Abraham Lincoln. Jim changed the name of John's dog from Spot to Odie after he learned that another comic strip already featured a dog named Spot. And Odie was such a unique name that Jim was sure no other comic strip would have a dog with the same name. In June 1978, United Feature Syndicate debuted Garfield in 41 newspapers, one of which was the Chicago Sun-Times. Now, the Chicago Sun-Times dropped the Garfield comic strip after a few weeks, but the newspaper got so many complaints from readers that they had no choice but to reinstate it. By 1981, less than 3 years after its initial launch, Garfield was in 850 newspapers. Merchandise alone accounted for more than $15 million in revenue. In the following year, 1982, Garfield was carried in over 1,000 newspapers. 20 years later, Garfield was the world's most syndicated comic strip. It appeared in more than 2,500 newspapers and had some 263 million readers around the world. And it just continued to grow. In 2004, Garfield merchandise accounted for somewhere between $750 million to $1 billion worth in 111 countries. Now, what kind of merchandise are we talking here? There were stuffed animals, ball caps, action figures, coffee mugs, clocks, night lights, cat beds, those things you stick on the inside of car windows, puzzles, clothing, plates, even slot machines and Garfield amusement rides. Since April 2014, Kathy Cothe has held the Guinness World Record for having the largest collection of Garfield memorabilia. At the time, she had 6,190 pieces in her collection, and her collection has certainly grown in the last decade. Speaking of Guinness World Records, Garfield holds the world record as the most widely syndicated comic strip. At the height of its popularity, Garfield appeared in more than 2,500 newspapers. Now, that's not to say that the Garfield comic strip has lost some of its popularity, But the whole newspaper business has been fighting a losing battle against online newspapers in recent years. In all of the success stories I've covered while researching Mr. Harvey's original broadcasts, the one constant in them is that all of the people who were successful were persistent. They never gave up. And so it was with Jim Davis. When his comic Norm Nat failed to catch on because people were unable to relate to bugs, Jim created a cat that we can all relate to, Garfield. One of my favorite expressions is, live each day as though it were your last. Garfield's version was, eat every meal as though it were your last. And he certainly had a way with words. And lasagna. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.